Good morning. We'll just give it a couple more seconds for the last attendees to get signed on. Good morning and welcome. My name is Juliette Tomlin, Director of Sales. We thank you for joining Woodlands for the first of our 3 webinar series. Today, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Brad Breeding. Brad's going to provide you with some valuable and objective insights to help guide you through the decision-making process of senior living. We will hear about the financial and healthcare advantages of life care. As some of you know, Woodlands is a life care community. Brad, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn this program over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Juliette. Appreciate the invitation to present today on behalf of Woodlands, and welcome to all of you that have joined us. It's a pleasure to spend a little bit of time with you this morning. So what we're really talking about today, of course, is planning your retirement future. Better information, better decisions. So I hope that today, we can cover some information. All of you, I'm guessing, since you're on this call, are really thinking about what's best for your future. And there's so many options. There's so much nuance out there, and it can be pretty overwhelming. And so I want to try to just share a little bit of information today that hopefully can help you as you go through that decision process. My background, before starting my company that I have now, I spent a number of years in financial advising. And it was really there as an advisor where I saw the need for just better information, better resources to help people make better informed decisions. And so really today, what I do at my life site, it's just an online resource for information and tools and so forth. And so what I want to do is just share, as I said, a little bit of that information with you today on this presentation. Just a couple of things really quickly before we get into the content. Number one, you all are all on mute right now, and that's by design because we have a big group and that limits background noise and distractions. But if you have a question as I present today, you can submit that in writing very easily. So the first thing you'll want to do to submit a question is open your control panel, which looks similar to what I'm showing you here on the screen. You should have a little orange button that looks like this one. You click that, it will either open up your control panel or it will, close it and move it back over to the side. So if you have a question, just open up your control panel. And then down here, there should be a section for questions. And it is there in that section where you can actually, if you click this little box out to the side, it'll make it even bigger on your screen. And that's where you can type in your question. And Juliette will be watching for those as I'm presenting. And then at the end, she will have those available. And if it's a question for me, I'll take it, or for her, and she can take it, and that kind of thing. So we encourage you to send in your questions as I'm presenting today. Quick disclaimer, anything that I talk about today should not be viewed as personal financial or tax advice. Now, this is not an investment presentation or anything like that, but we are talking about planning, and obviously money is a part of this decision process and finances. And so just know that this isn't intended to be advice. You need to talk with your own financial professionals. And also, this is not meant to be a solicitation or recommendation of any retirement community on my behalf. Now, I do think that communities like Woodlands can be a really great solution for people. I've seen that many, many times. I've had the opportunity to visit hundreds of retirement communities like Woodlands, and I hear the personal stories. So I do know how great of a solution it can be for some people, but I also know that you've all got to make your own decision based on what's best for you and the information that you have available and your preferences. So hopefully, anything that I present to you today will be viewed in an unbiased and objective way. So here's what I want to cover with you. First of all, what are some of the top concerns among older adults? This is a good, I think, starting point, because really when we talk about planning for your future, we have to address some of these popular concerns. And then I want to move into the components of a comprehensive retirement plan. Now, again, this isn't an investment seminar or anything like that, but when we talk about retirement planning, I'm really, there's two ways to look at it. There's planning for retirement, and there's also planning through retirement. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today, and how where you live and senior living can fit into that picture potentially. And then, of course, we'll talk about some of the trade-offs in senior living, some of those nuances that I talked about earlier, and some of the things that can be confusing. We'll try to break some of that down. And finally, we'll talk about some of the key aspects of the decision process, what to think about as you're going through there. And as I mentioned, we'll end with Q&A. So I want to start by sharing with you one of my favorite quotes. It comes from a popular 20th century philosopher that I know you're all familiar with, named Yogi Berra. Yogi once said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. It's really kind of true when you think about it. And I like this because what we're really talking about today is planning your future, planning your best future. And if you don't have some sense of where you want to go, what's most important to you, and those kind of things, a roadmap, if you will, then we could end up any place. So with that in mind, this is an important question I would pose to all of you. If you were to take some time this afternoon or later this morning and really think about this question, at this stage in your life, what does peace of mind mean for you? Not only today, but thinking about the future. What's important to you? What do you want to see in your future? What do you not want to see in your future? And everything that goes along with that. This can be a really good first step in planning, because it really goes back visualizing what's important and all these things, that can really help establish a good starting place in your planning. So as you keep that question in mind, let's look at some of the things that really are heavy on the minds or concerns of many older adults, retirees. This was a survey that was done several years ago now, but I think it's still very relevant. I suspect the answers will be very similar today. And this was done by Merrill Lynch and a group called AgeWave. And they asked people 65 and older, what are some of the biggest concerns you have about living a long life? And why a long life? Well, because we know overall we are living longer, but there's a lot of things that come along with that. So the number one answer was serious health problems. Not a huge surprise. Second biggest, or second most popular answer, or the second biggest concern, is not being a burden on family. I've seen other surveys that have had this at 70 or 80%. You even see things on here like being lonely and not having a purpose, these sort of social wellness types of concerns. So as you think about that question I asked you a moment ago, and what does peace of mind really mean for you? And if you think about your future and what's important, I would suspect that in many ways, peace of mind is really kind of the opposite of these concerns. In other words, the extent to which you can minimize or avoid these concerns through planning, then the more peace of mind you'll have. So how do we do that? What do we need to be thinking about? Well, this goes to what I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about what a retirement plan is. Now, when I talk about, if I were to use the word retirement plan with most people, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is finances. That is certainly an important part of any retirement plan. And these other three categories I'm going to share with you really kind of all come back to finances. They're all interconnected in some way. But, all these things, your investments and retirement accounts, income strategies, tax efficient planning, and all of these things are certainly very important. But if we think more broadly about what else should be included in that plan, the next thing I would point to is wellness. Now, you may say, what does wellness have to do with a retirement plan? Well, what was the number one concern on that survey I showed you a moment ago? Serious health concerns. There were also things on there like being lonely and not having a purpose. So when we think about wellness in a broader context, it really comes back even to money in some ways, because those serious health concerns, there's some heavy expenses that come along with those, right? So in theory, the better we're living out wellness in our lives today, then that can certainly not only help our overall well-being now, but in theory limit or reduce the potential for those serious health concerns and the cost of those concerns later. Now, when you think about wellness, I think we have to really consider what goes into that. First of all, there's the physical component, certainly diet and exercise, so forth. But wellness is multifaceted. You have the social piece, which is almost maybe even more important in some cases than the physical component. Social interactions, meaningful social interactions on a regular basis are really important to our overall health, probably more than we often even realize. Emotional wellness, dealing with some of the different things, different stages of life, and whether it's loss or, that sense of maybe not having that sense of purpose, whatever it is, that kind of would fit in this category to some degree. Spiritual wellness, vocational wellness. This too, when we talk about purpose, sometimes that's more vocational. For those that have had, maybe spent 30 or 40 years in a career, and that's kind of what they were known and recognized and respected for, filling that void, particularly later in the retirement years, can become difficult. So finding some way to renew or maintain purpose is exceptionally important to our health. And so that would kind of go in this vocational piece to some extent. And then intellectual, challenging our minds, continuing to learn and grow intellectually is very important. So all of these things work together to make up your overall. I think it's important to really, take an inventory of how well you're doing in each of these areas, because that can help, as I said, reduce those serious health concerns later. But then we have to ask, okay, what happens if? Because in some cases, maybe we live a very healthy life up until the very end. In some cases, maybe health kind of changes or declines gradually over the years. And then for others, health can change very suddenly and unexpectedly, whether it's a stroke or a fall or heart attack or cancer or some other health condition. Things can change much more suddenly. And so no matter what the situation is, but particularly if it's suddenly, the question becomes, what's the plan in that case? Where would you be? Where would you want to be? What services would be available? Who would need to be involved? All of these things are important. And that leads, of course, to the next piece, which is family. What involvement would you want from your family, as I mentioned? But even things, on that survey, one of the things was having enough money to leave to my family and so forth. The second biggest concern, not being a burden on my family. So you can see how all these things kind of come together when you think more broadly about a retirement plan. But here's what I would really encourage you to consider, and that's that where you live, not just now, but throughout your retirement years, plays a really important role in every one of these categories. Where you live can have an impact on everything that I've gone through here. Wellness, where you live plays a big role in that. The community around you, or the lack thereof in some cases. What resources you have available, the safety, physical safety of your home, and what kind of things might need to be done to the home and what have you. Certainly your post-health event plan, especially, as I said, if something changes very suddenly, where you're living in that moment could dictate what that situation looks like, and certainly could dictate to the extent your family would need to be involved. So really considering that housing is a big part of this plan, I think that's important. So as we think about that, what are the choices? I guess, if you're on this call, you're at least considering the different options that are available to you. So when you get right down to it, everybody, all of you have really two main choices. Now there's categories under each, and we'll talk about that. But the two main choices, of course, are to stay in your own house. A lot of people say they want to stay in their own home for reasons that I can completely understand. There's that familiarity, the memories. There's often a very emotional connection to our home. For so many people, I think the biggest thing is that the home represents independence. And that's always an interesting thing to me, because we have to really ask ourselves, what does independence mean? What does independence really mean to you? Because I have seen, and I'm sure you all have too, so many situations where somebody, they're still in their home because that's their wish, but it is anything but an independent situation. And so we have to remember or think about, what does independence really mean? What does that look like for you? And for some, it's just simply is remaining in the home represents independence, even when it's not the most independent situation. And then, of course, if you're not in your own house, living in a retirement community. As I mentioned, there's different categories, and we'll talk about that next. But, if you're not in your own home, the other option is some sort of a community setting. Now, sometime back, I was presenting, it's been a few years ago, and a gentleman said, I missed one. He raised his hand. He said, you missed one. And when I said, what's that? He said, move in with the kids. And, it got a big laugh, and still does every time I say that, but in a live event. But I mention this because while it is kind of humorous, the other thing is that it's sometimes this is done. Sometimes because people want to, sometimes maybe because they need to. We are seeing more and more of this, but I will tell you this: the reason I mention this, the bigger reason is that if you were to go back decades and decades, certainly back like pre-industrial revolution, but even beyond that to some degree, it wasn't uncommon for multiple generations to live together. And of course, people weren't living as long back then, but multiple generations, particularly if they were farming or agriculture, and maybe they worked together during the day on the farm, they shared meals together. The older members of the family were the elders that kind of looked after the younger members, and it all sort of worked for many people. But so much has changed since then. We have done a really good job of spreading ourselves out over the last 50 or 60 years, and there's more dual income families than ever before. There's higher divorce rates than ever before. So there's more solo agers, if you will. People are working in all different parts of the country, all different parts of the world, and logistically, and practically speaking, it doesn't work as well for many families today, just because of all those things I've mentioned and much more. And so what that's done is it's left this gap. It's left this sort of, I call it the retirement gap, where you really have to ask, what's the best way for me to fill that gap? And really, when we talk about that, what do I mean by that? It's really all those concerns I mentioned earlier. It's so important that you're planning for yourself today more than ever before. So I commend you for being on this call, because there's that big void that we now have to sort of plan for ourselves and say, what's the best path forward for me to limit or avoid those concerns? So with that, let's talk about what are some of the different options. If we're looking at other options besides living in your own home, because maybe you've already considered some of what I've mentioned. And so what are those other options? Well, I'm going to go through a few of these in just a moment, but let me start by pointing you down here to the bottom of this slide. So you'll see the far left, it says no help needed. Let's just call that total independence. Okay, so if you're on this side of this sort of this bar, if you're over here on this side of it, then you're living independently. And in other words, you don't need any sort of care or assistance on a daily basis. The other end over here is the complete opposite. This will be the other end of the spectrum, which is 24-hour care, 24-hour nursing care, skilled nursing care, whatever it may be. And then, of course, we have different sort of levels in between, whether it's a little bit of help, a little assisted living help, or memory care, and these different things. So that represents the continuum, okay, the full continuum from independent to dependent, and then a little bit in between, perhaps. So keeping that in mind, let's look at the different options that are out there. The first option is, and you have to be careful with the terminology because it's used in lots of different ways, but let's just call this, for the sake of this example, an active adult community. These are typically 55 and older, sometimes 62 and older neighborhoods, just planned developments. And I don't know how many of these you have in your area where you live, but a lot of times it'll just be a neighborhood. The exterior maintenance is maybe handled for you. Interior maintenance you're still responsible for. Maybe there's a pool and a clubhouse, those kind of things, maybe not. Maybe homeowners association dues, but it's really just a planned development for those 55 and older. Usually they're freestanding homes, maybe apartments in some cases. But you'll see here, of course, they're focused on this side, right? This no help needed or independence, because it's really like living in your own home in the sense that if your needs changed, now you're back to, okay, where do we go now? What's next from here? And that leads me to the next one, which is often called a rental retirement community or independent plus. Again, there's a lot of terminology, but these are rental or apartment style retirement communities, again, 55 and older. And you'll see they stretch out a little further on this spectrum in the sense that if you need some help, assisted living or something, sometimes maybe they bring care into your apartment. In other cases, maybe there's some separately, licensed assisted living residences within that community. So you have to kind of look at that and see, what's available there. But the point is that these communities do come a little further out on the spectrum. And then we have assisted living and nursing care. So these really don't focus on the left side of this at all, right? Because these residents living in these communities are receiving some level of care. And then finally, we have what's often called a life plan community or a continuing care retirement community. Now, Woodlands falls in this category, and effectively what you'll see is that it's some combination of all of these previous categories. And how that's done can be a little bit different from one community to another, but the bigger point is just that you have this sort of, let's say, contractual access to these different services over your lifetime, okay? So for a lot of people, they like that because it goes back to that peace of mind. No matter where I am on this continuum, I have what I need available to me, and I don't have to worry about being a burden on my family. I don't have to worry about where to go next if things change and so forth. So that's obviously one of the big attractions of a life plan community, is that peace of mind. But again, pretty much every planned senior living community would fall in one of these categories. So I think understanding that can help you in your research and comparisons. So now that we've looked at that, let's talk a little bit about what happens, with the cost. How does the cost work? Well, I'm going to back up one moment. These next couple of slides, I'm going to be focused primarily on this last one, because since it does kind of cover all those previous categories, there's a little more complexity that goes into it. And so let's just talk about that for a moment. So the first thing you'll find is that a lot of life plan communities, most of them, require an entry fee. And that entry fee is used in a variety of ways, but let's just, without getting into too much detail today, let's just say there's a correlation between that entry fee and the fact that you have access to that entire continuum. So the entry fee model evolved out of a model that really came around more than 100 years ago. Back then it looked much different, but the entry fee model just kind of evolved out of that. And so what you'll find if you're looking at life plan communities like Woodlands is that a lot of times there will be an entry fee. And that entry fee, I'll just show you a few examples of how those can work. This can be different from one. These are just conceptual examples. It can always be different from one community to another. But you'll often find that many life plan communities have an entry fee contract that works kind of like this. You pay the entry fee when you move in, and that can vary depending on the community, certainly, but also depending on the size, whether it's a 1-bedroom apartment or a 2 or 3-bedroom. Obviously that impacts the cost and the entry fee. But what you'll find with this particular type is that some portion of that entry fee is refundable on a declining basis. It's often called a traditional contract, but you'll see, again, this is just an example, but maybe in the first year, it's refundable 70% or 80%. The next year, maybe it's refundable at a lesser extent, and you can see it just declines down. And at some point, in this example, the 4th year, but at some point, there's no more refund remaining. So this is called a traditional contract where that entry fee refund just declines over the years. Now you'll find others where, and let's say all other things being equal. I think that's important to understand this because other things are not always equal, but all other things being equal, you may find one that looks like this, where you pay more for the same exact residence, but if you ever need care, in this example, your refund doesn't go below 50%. You may find others where, again, all other things being equal, you pay yet a higher entry fee, but in this case, it doesn't go below 90%. So, as I mentioned, all other things being equal, this is normally how those sort of trade-offs work. You can pay a little higher entry fee to get more back. Now, you need to understand the contract and the stipulations around the entry fee and all those things. This is just conceptual. So when you're doing your comparisons and analysis, you kind of know what to look for and how these trade-offs work. Now let's talk about what happens on a monthly basis. And what I'm really talking about here is what happens to your monthly cost over time if you should require care. So again, we're talking about a life plan community, a community that covers that complete continuum, okay? Everything from independent living all the way through to nursing care. The most popular option looks like this. Basically, no matter where you live within that community, whether you're in independent living or assisted living or nursing care, no matter what services you're receiving, you pay the same monthly cost. That's called a life care contract. So for people who like predictability, for people who really like to know what their out-of-pocket cost exposure is, no matter what level of care they need or how long they need it, life care can be a really good option. Now, I know Woodlands offers a life care contract, and my understanding is that they are, I think, the only provider in the state to offer life care. So you may not have seen these at other communities, or seen this, I should say, but this is how life care works. So it's really for people that like that predictability in their cost. Now, the one thing I will say, Woodlands is a little bit unique, and I actually kind of like this, is that the nursing care is provided in a separate location, but they pay the cost difference. So if you need that nursing care, they cover that cost difference for you. But in talking with Juliet, it sounds like very few residents ever actually need that level of care because they're able to provide most of what their residents need right there within the community, kind of in this mid-tier category. So I know Juliet can talk to you more about that. But from a pricing standpoint, it all remains, the same. Now, that's not to say there can't be ancillary charges or inflationary increases, but the point is you don't pay more for care when you need it. Some other communities you may find work more like this. And I'll say again, all other things being equal. In that case, you'll find that while you're living independently, you would probably pay less, either in the form of a lower entry fee or a lower monthly fee. However, if you need care later, you would pay the full cost of that care, which can be very expensive, as you know, just depending on what type of care you need and certainly how long you need it. So in this case, your cost exposure is unlimited in the sense that, you'll pay the full cost for care and you don't know how much care or how long you'll need it. And so that's how this model works. You still have the entry fee, but your monthly fee, is lower, and then you'll pay the full cost of care. There's some communities that are kind of a blend of these two. I won't get into that too much, kind of a hybrid. And then lastly, when it comes to rental communities, if it's just a monthly rental, well, again, if it's the same types of services, let's just say one community was offering all of these options. In that case, even the cost while living independently would have to be higher. If there's no entry fee, it's being collected as you go. So the monthly cost would have to be higher. And then, of course, you would still pay the full cost of care when needed, if it's even available. Remember, I showed you sometimes that nursing care may not be available, but nonetheless, this is how the cost works among those different options. So this is really an important thing to understand, and particularly as you're talking to Juliet, looking at Woodlands, knowing how life care works compared to the other options out there and how it's unique in the sense that it really gives you that predictability. So before we go to Q&A in a few moments, I want to spend a little bit of time talking here briefly about some of the key aspects of the decision process. And there's certainly other ones, but these are the four main ones that I would really encourage you to think about. First, understand the contract. I've talked a little bit about how some of that works today, but as I've already mentioned, you need to do your own research and understanding, make sure all of your questions are answered in terms of the contract and how that works. And hopefully any community that you're talking to is forthcoming with that information and answering your questions in a way that you're confident. Next comes to the management team. The financial management of the organization is very important. The how long they've been doing it, their track record, who's involved, their background, their expertise, and even to some degree, how are residents even involved? Do the residents and the management team and the board and so forth have a really strong and productive working relationship? That's really important. So, really, you're making a commitment to that community. They're making a commitment to you. You want to make sure that that commitment's intact for the long term. So all of those things are important. The quality of care. After all, one of the main reasons that somebody would choose a life plan or a life care community is to make sure you have that care if you should ever need it. But that means you also want to make sure it's good, high quality care that you can feel good about, the type of care that you would expect to receive if you should need it. So you want to do your due diligence on that and ask the right questions, and maybe even observe or talk, anybody else that's have family members there or anything like that. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, the community and the culture. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I've often said that a retirement community is more than just a place to move into. It's really a community of people. right? As I said before, I've had the chance to visit lots of retirement communities, and I often ask residents, what do you like most about living here? And one of the most popular answers I get to that is they'll say the people and the relationships. And sometimes, hopefully, that includes the staff as well as the residents. But that's so important. So you want to make sure it's a good fit in terms of the culture and the people there. Do everything you can to get a feel for that, because I can tell you that's going to be really meaningful, not only when you move in and those friendships that you'll develop, but also down the road. I've had so many people tell me that what they like most is knowing that if they should need care, that they've kind of got a built-in, neighborhood of support right there where they live, people that can kind of walk that journey with them, and vice versa. That's meaningful to be there for each other like that. So I think that's important. And I think even last year, we heard some of the tragic stories in nursing homes, certainly, but for those living in independent living, like those that are still active and independent within Woodlands, for example, I've had residents tell me that they talked with their friends that were at home, and by nearly every measure, they were more fulfilled socially, and from a wellness standpoint than some of their friends who were in their own home and kind of quarantined during that time. So even last year, I think that sense of community was really valuable, and we didn't hear a lot about that, but that's an important consideration. It goes back to that social wellness piece we talked about earlier. So again, there's other things certainly to consider, but I think these are some of the main ones, and there's a lot of different questions to be asked under each category. But I hope that some of the information I've shared with you here today is helpful. As you might can tell, I could probably go on for another couple hours on these things, but that's all the time that I have. And so we're going to go to Q&A. I'll ask Juliet to come back and join me, but I want to just thank you all for your time, and certainly I hope you've learned something that can be helpful to you in your decision process from here. So, Juliet? Hey, there you are.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Brad. That was great. And I'm sure you've pumped a lot of our guests up. I've been fortunate enough to have heard you speak before. So informative, and I'm sure our participants have learned a great deal from you. We are going to answer a few of the questions that have been sent through during your presentation. Actually, I'm going to throw the first one at you, if that's okay.
Sure.
Do you recommend keeping a long-term policy if you have one? Or would you suggest possibly giving it up because you are moving into a life care community?
That's a great question. And you might want to mute for just a moment, Juliet. I hear getting a little bit of feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great question, and I get that a lot. So just to reiterate, the question is, if you move into a life care community like Woodlands, meaning that no matter whether you're living independently or receiving care, your cost is the same. Sometimes people will say, do I need to keep my long-term care insurance policy? Because effectively that is kind of like a lifetime long-term care policy. And my answer to that is, I would never advise somebody to drop their long-term care insurance. You certainly could, obviously, if you wanted to, but and you have to weigh out the cost considerations and everything, because I know so many long-term care policies have increased dramatically their premiums over the last few years. So you have to consider all of that. But that aside, just conceptually, I wouldn't suggest somebody drop their policy, because things can always change. I mean, maybe for some totally unforeseen reason, you have to move back out later. I mean, who knows what kind of things can pop up in life, and then you don't have the life care community or that policy, or there may be some reason you want to still use it. I mean, you can still use it even in a life care community. So, if you think about it, you need care. Let's just suppose you need care. You're still paying the same monthly cost, but now you can use your long-term care insurance on top of that. So your monthly cost could be less than you were paying even when you were living independently once you factor in the long-term care insurance. So there's a lot to weigh, in that decision, but that's just sort of my short, high-level answer to that.
Okay, that was good. Brad, another one. Do you think there's an advantage to a non-for-profit community versus for-profit?
I think that answer could be yes. I mean, I think it could certainly be yes in some situations. It really kind of depends on what that means to somebody. I mean, so the couple of things that typically come up with that question are, number one, and this is what you'll probably hear the most, is that not-for-profits won't kick you out, if you will. Meaning, if you run out of money, if you, due to no fault of your own, if you exhaust your assets, most not-for-profit communities like Woodlands, and it's this is part of what makes them a not-for-profit, is that charitable component where you can stay there. You're not forced to leave. There's some financial assistance that's normally available. Now, as I've said all along through the presentation, you need to understand how that works and what goes into that and everything, but that is one of the things that you'll hear most often from people. And the other, I think, is that it's just, a nonprofit a lot of times will be a little bit more mission driven. Just the mindset and the mentality of the community maybe is a little more mission driven, a little more charitable in their approach to things, whereas a for-profit may not be. However, having said that, there's lots of nice for-profit communities out there that do a great job. So I always try to, take, as I said, an unbiased view to that. But those are probably the two biggest things that you'll hear.
Right. I have one that was just sent through. The participant today wanted to know if they had to eat in the dining room or did we deliver food. And Ron Smith, the Director of Dining Services, and our chef, Brett, he and his team are more than happy to bring your meals to your room. That's sort of even enhanced during COVID. So it's something that we are continuing to do. And those meals are actually the meals that are being served in the dining room, that particular lunch or dinner, breakfast, etc. Another one, Brad, this one to you. How do I know that I won't run out of money, or what if I do, if I live at a CCRC like Woodlands?
Well, one of the really good things about a life plan community like Woodlands is that question is just as important to them as it is to you. Because remember, I said that a lot of times you'll have that financial assistance that's provided, and while that is there, a community has to be very careful, because if every single person that moved in ran out of money, then it's really hard to maintain that commitment and that financial assistance and that promise. And so they'll typically do a financial evaluation on the front end to make sure that you're a good fit financially. And if you're not, they'll tell you that, because it's just as important to them as it is to you. Now, here's the other thing though. That doesn't mean that sometimes people don't exist, because sometimes we outlive the averages, right? We may live much longer than average, or we may need more care than average. So certainly sometimes people do exhaust their assets, and that gets back to what I mentioned earlier about having that financial assistance that's often available to you. But how do you know if you're going to run out or not? I think, as I said, the community will look at that, certainly. But if you have a good advisor that understands these things I've talked about today, and that's important, they need to understand all these different contract types and everything I've mentioned. But if they understand that, then hopefully they can help you to kind of run some projections as well.
All right, I have a question, and one of our guests have asked what is included in the monthly service fee here at Woodlands. So of course it is your life care, the guarantee of transitioning over under that life care price. Your dining meal plan, which are 2 meals a day. If you do enjoy 3 meals, you can certainly add the breakfast to your monthly statement. Your utilities are included. You also have your internet, your 24 7-day-a-week emergency response system. What that is, it's a pull cord in your bedroom and your bath, as well as a pendant. Maintenance-free living. On a maintenance-free living, that means from anything, if your dishwasher would go out, your washer and dryer, a disposal, even if your light over the vanity in your bathroom goes out, we will place a work order for you, and that is taken care of that day. Housekeeping, you get every 2 weeks a team of 2, and your basic cable TV. So pretty much standard amenities, but very, very good ones. One ad I saw, and you do work with so many properties, Brad, I saw an advertisement before going to Leading Age in San Diego. And they did this advertising. It's a real neat young couple, and they're dancing on a boardwalk. And they said, "We're cutting the rug while so-and-so in their lawn care is cutting our grass." So the other one was something about today we signed on with a community, and we not only did we sign on with that, we got a chef, a physical trainer, and a chauffeur. So we do offer quite a bit at a continuing care retirement community. I think we'll have time for one more. Is there one type of contract or refund to the entry fee that is greater, that's a greater benefit to my children?
You know, that's I don't know that I could say there's one that's a greater benefit for your children, because the reality is, I can tell you, I'm going to give you kind of 2 answers to that. The first answer is, we don't know what the future holds for any of us in terms of, as I said earlier, how long we're going to live or how much care we're going to need, or any of these other things. And so, you know, certainly that would ultimately play a role in determining how much you leave for your kids. And, you know, that sort of, there's some interplay there too with the types of contracts that I mentioned earlier. Life care, you know, as offered by Woodlands, certainly the more care you need, the more valuable that benefit becomes, right? So if you needed 3 or 4 or 5 years of care, which some people do, then that all of a sudden looks really, really good, because you're not having to pay that additional cost for that care over all those years. So you have those kind of, you know, hypotheticals that we just don't know that would ultimately determine things. But now the second piece of that is, and again, I'm going to stop short of saying one's better for your kids, but again, with a life care contract, it does give you that predictability. And so when you're doing your planning, you know, if you look at that, particularly if it's combined with a refundable entry fee, you know, then you look at that and you can say, all right, well, I pretty much know what, I don't know, let's say 80% of my monthly expenses are going to be for the rest of my life. You can plan that out. It takes some of the unknowns out of your planning. And so you can kind of see where that would put you over, you know, 10, 15, 20 years, or however long you want to extrapolate that out. So what that predictability is worth, you know, I think you have to think about that.
Brad, it's just been a great session, just wonderful. We want to be respectful of your time as well as our guests. If we didn't get to your specific question, Hannah or I will be following up in the next couple of days. We can answer your specific questions at that time. But you sharing your knowledge with our guests today has just been phenomenal. Oh, great, this is a wonderful slide. Before we sign off, it is a reminder that our next webinar is June 24th at 2, and it is a roundtable discussion with our leadership team. And then as you see on Thursday, the 29th at 2, we have Meet Our Residents. So hopefully you all will be able to join us for those as well. In the meantime, I would personally like to invite you to come up and visit with me or Hannah and take a look at everything that we have to offer here. On behalf of Woodlands, in fact, all of us at Woodlands, we appreciate the time that you've spent with us this morning and the interest that you've shown in our community. I wish all of you a happy and safe Memorial Day weekend and see you soon. Thanks, Brad.